Oh! I've got issues. Hey folks, it's Chris, and today I have issues with Spider-Man One More Day. Why? Well, I'm going to get into it, but you should know that this was a 4-issue story originally intended to come out in August of 2007, but due to delays by the artist, who also happened to be the editor-in-chief of Marvel, Joe Quesada, it didn't finish coming out until about 5 months after it started in January of 2008. You know what? I'll get into exactly what problems I have, but this isn't like ripping off a Band-Aid. It's gonna hurt whether we go slow or fast. Anyway, let's get into the issues that I have with Spider-Man One More Day. So is my problem with the idea behind it? The idea was to make Peter Parker single again after being married to Mary Jane Watson for nearly 20 years of comic book stories. No, absolutely not. At least 40% of marriages end, so in a way, why should Spider-Man be so unique? You could absolutely have his marriage end and have it either be tragic or good for both characters. So I'm not at all against the idea. I'm against the execution. You see, editorial pressure dictated this move, not a creative decision. Writer J. Michael Straczynski wasn't too into it allegedly, but Quesada wanted it to happen. In fact, Straczynski asked Marvel to remove his name from the latter 2 issues of the story. Instead, Quesada just added himself as the co-writer. That's like asking your coworker to do a presentation at work, and his compromise is inviting your parents to watch it alongside your other coworkers. This Spider-Man story concept is so flawed. Spider-Man sometimes fights an alien or a demon, but most of his stories are either street-level crime or science gone amok. So the central conceit in One More Day is that the devil wants to end Peter Parker's marriage. It's not a great fit. Some of that I will lay at J. Michael Straczynski's feet. He added a lot of supernatural elements to Spider-Man. Personally, I didn't love them, but you know what? Your mileage may vary on that point, and I respect that. The story deals with fallout from the first Civil War crossover. Iron Man, Tony Stark, had befriended Spider-Man and convinced him to reveal his identity publicly as part of Tony's initiative to get superheroes working as official government employees. I didn't care for that story either, but let's not get sidetracked. So Kingpin now knows who Spider-Man is, and he naturally sends an assassin to kill him. Unfortunately, the bullet hit Peter's elderly Aunt May, and she falls into a coma and will die soon. That's the setup. Fine. I'm with you so far. In part 1 from Amazing Spider-Man number 544, we instantly have Peter acting wildly out of character. Should he be upset? No question. Is Peter usually the kind of guy to flip out on a doctor for pointing out that there are bills to pay? No, of course not. Peter rushes over to Avengers Tower and he's in such a hurry he doesn't even wear his suit. What's his emergency? To scream at Tony Stark, because A, Tony convinced Peter to open up about his identity, and B, Tony is rich and can help with the medical bills. Well, the first part is really on you, Peter, and you're usually pretty good about that whole taking responsibility because you have great power thing. The money thing. Who flips out on anyone for not giving them money? I mean, Tony secretly does end up giving his butler money to help, but it's also not really his aunt. I don't know. It's just kind of weird. It gets so much weirder in the next issue. Because in part 2, Peter goes to Doctor Strange and asks for a magic cure, which makes sense in a comic book world. Why wouldn't Peter ask for magic help? But in a grounded story way, it's kind of nuts because none of us have access to sorcerers. And since they can't give Doctor Strange the ability to just cure anyone anytime, he can't help. So the issue is mostly really pointless. There's one good thing in this issue and one bad thing. The good. Peter talks about feeling guilty for creating the situation in which the shooting happened. He acknowledges responsibility for publicly revealing his identity. The bad. The narration that begins this issue is from Mephisto, Marvel's main version of the devil, and he says, "Tune your ear to the frequency of despair and cross-reference by the longitude and latitude of a heart in agony." That's how robots talk. That's terrible. So Peter tries to use one of Doctor Strange's mystical items to change the past, only to learn that he can't. Doctor Strange warns Peter not to try to change things, and on a meta level, that might be J. Michael Straczynski commenting on the ongoing serialized idea of Marvel superheroes. At a certain point, they just stopped allowing any meaningful change, and the status quo is constantly reset. Did any readers actually think this story would end with Aunt May dying? I know I didn't. The third issue is also a type of filler issue. It's kind of like a quick comic book version of It's a Wonderful Life, where Peter sees himself in two alternate realities. One where he never got superpowers and he became a pudgy, angry nerd, and another where he became a wealthy but lonely old man. He also keeps seeing a little red-headed girl that tells him to man up and be responsible. Pretty depressing, but ultimately relatively meaningless. It's probably supposed to be a big twist that in the final issue, we realized that girl could have been Peter and Mary Jane's daughter. At the end of part 3, Mephisto shows up and he tells Peter that he'll save Aunt May's life if he and Mary Jane decide to give up their marriage to him within 24 hours. So there we have the central conflict of this story. Finally, the devil doesn't even want his soul. He wants Peter's marriage, because I guess that would make Peter and Mary Jane's souls suffer. It sort of makes sense for Mephisto, but issue 4 is Peter and Mary Jane thinking about this proposition, and come on. Aunt May has been portrayed as something close to death's door since day one, and Peter is supposed to give up his wife, who he loves, to give Aunt May more time? It's not fun for an old relative to pass away, but it's also part of life. And that's why I have a problem with this story. Not because it wanted to eliminate Peter's marriage. Not necessarily because the devil makes it happen. It's because the central conflict, the decision Peter has to make, is ridiculous. Let your aunt die of unfortunate, normal causes. But in the final issue, the couple ultimately agrees to make the deal. And Mary Jane even gets Mephisto to sweeten the pot by making the world forget Peter's secret identity. So that was a story change that only got explored for a few months before it was reset. Mephisto also reveals if they'd stayed together, they would have had a kid. The couple is supposedly given one last day together, but the comic is in such a rush it just skips ahead to bedtime. In other words, the actual stakes involved, Peter's relationship, is barely even addressed. So, Peter loses his marriage and gets to have his secret identity, his elderly aunt, and bachelorhood. It almost feels like he's being rewarded for a very selfish decision. It is not a very adult decision. Peter previously lost his girlfriend Gwen Stacy. Sure, that reset him to a single guy, but he also learned something from it. So my greatest problem with this comic is the nature of mainstream publishers to editorially dictate that the status quo must be reset. You have to understand that from the 60s through the 80s, that was not always the case for Marvel's superhero books. Peter went from high school to college to the working world. His girlfriend Gwen Stacy died. His archenemy the Green Goblin died. These were permanent changes for decades. In other comics, we had Mr. Fantastic and the Invisible Woman get married and have a son who grew up. We had Jean Grey of the X-Men die. These things were permanent changes, but by the end of the 80s, death became a revolving door. Characters would come back from stories where they died. Relationships would end and get reset to square one. But for a while, there was growth. This story represents the opposite of that. It not only resets things, it does so in a way that feels like it was mandated at the corporate level. So I don't love the execution, but that's not my biggest problem with this story. The biggest problem I have is the idea behind the story, how it was generated. It's just an editorially mandated status quo reset, and that's what bothers me. It feels very phony. Everything about this kind of bothers me. I don't love the artwork. I used to like Quesada when I was younger. I don't feel this is his best work. That's just a personal opinion. Look at this. Even the cover says this, still only 399 cents. And I guess that's supposed to evoke the nostalgia we'd see when a comic book said something like, still only 60 cents. But this is 399 cents. And guess what? The other issues that Marvel was putting out at the same period of time were $2.99. So they're going to charge you $1 more and say only in the corner for all 4 issues. One more day? How about one more screw you to the fans?